job came up on a Thursday, and I took it on a Friday, which should tell you how things were going. I had been out of regular work for 14 months by then. My wife had stopped asking me how the search was going, which was worse than when she used to ask every night. The position was listed as Relief Signal Technician, Grade 2, based out of a small operations hut between Driffield and Bridlington, covering a stretch of line that ran through farmland and old beet fields and the occasional patch of woodland that nobody seemed to own. The man who interviewed me did it over the phone. His name was Mr. Aldridge, and he had the kind of voice that sounded like he had been doing the same job for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by anything. He asked me 3 questions. Did I have my signaling certificates current? Did I mind being alone for long stretches? Did I have any family commitments that would make night work difficult? I answered yes, no, and no, in that order, and he told me to come up the following Monday and bring a torch with a red filter because the one in the hut was unreliable. I drove up on the Sunday evening and stayed in a bed and breakfast in a village called Nafferton. The woman who ran it asked me what brought me to the area, and when I told her, she nodded the way people nod when they have heard the answer before and have learned not to comment on it. She gave me a key and told me breakfast was from 7, and then she said, almost as an afterthought, that if I was working the line at night I should keep my phone charged. I asked her why, and she said, because the signal out there can be patchy, love, that's all. The hut was exactly what you would expect. Breeze block walls painted a color that had probably once been cream, a metal door with a stiff lock, a desk with 2 monitors, a kettle, a microwave, and a logbook the size of a small Bible. There was a chair that had molded itself to the shape of whoever sat in it most often, and a heater that worked when it wanted to. Outside, the line ran north to south, through a cutting, with embankments on either side and a footbridge about 200 yards down that nobody used because the village it had once served had been demolished in the 70s. My job, as Aldridge explained it on my first morning, was straightforward. The line was a secondary route, mostly freight, the occasional passenger service rerouted when the main coastal line had problems. There was a 4-aspect signal about 150 yards south of the hut, designated EY117. My job was to monitor it, log any faults, respond to dispatch when they called, and walk the line if anything came up that the cameras could not resolve. 12-hour shifts, 4 on and 4 off, with another technician on the opposite rotation who I would meet at handover. His name was Tom Reaver. He was about 60, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for most of its life, and he shook my hand without quite looking at me. He showed me how the monitors worked, how to interpret the aspect indicators, how to log a fault, how to call dispatch on the dedicated line, and how to use the radio if the line went down. He showed me where the spare bulbs were, where the cleaning kit was, and where the first aid box was kept. He took me through everything thoroughly and patiently, and I remember thinking he was a decent man, and that I had been lucky to land a partner who would not make my life difficult. At the end of the handover, just before he left, he tapped the logbook with 2 fingers and said, "You will see entries in here about EY117. The signal goes red sometimes when it should not. When it does, log the time, log the duration, and call dispatch only if it stays red for more than 4 minutes. Do not call them sooner. Do not walk down to it. Just log it and wait." I asked him what caused it. He thought about that for a moment, the way a man thinks when he is choosing between 2 answers, and then he said, "The wiring is old. The whole installation is old. It does what old equipment does." Then he picked up his bag and left. The first shift was quiet. I made tea. I read the logbook. I watched the monitors. EY117 sat at green for most of the day, cycled to yellow and then red twice for scheduled freight movements, and otherwise behaved exactly the way a signal is supposed to behave. The logbook, when I went through it properly, was where things began to feel slightly off. The entries were neat and professional and went back about 11 years. Most of them were ordinary. Bulb replacements, cable inspections, weather damage, the usual. But scattered through the pages, sometimes once a week and sometimes once a month, were entries that read EY117 read, unscheduled, duration 2 minutes 17 seconds. EY117 read, unscheduled, duration 3 minutes 40 seconds. EY117 read, unscheduled, duration 1 minute 50. None of them ever crossed 4 minutes. Not one in 11 years. That should have struck me harder than it did. I think I was tired from the drive and the new environment, and I told myself that of course they never crossed 4 minutes, because if they had, dispatch would have been called and engineers would have come out and fixed whatever was wrong. The 4-minute threshold was the trigger for action. Everything below it was just noise. I worked 3 shifts before anything happened. On the 4th shift, a Wednesday night, I was eating a sandwich at about 2 in the morning when EY117 went red. There was no train scheduled. I looked at the monitor, looked at the clock, and started timing it. The signal sat there, calm and steady, glowing red in the dark beyond the hut window. I could see it directly if I leaned to my left, a small fixed point of color above the rails. At 2 minutes and 48 seconds, it cycled back to green. I logged it. Duration 2 minutes 48. Unscheduled, no train movement, no fault indicated on the diagnostic. I went back to my sandwich. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang. Not the dispatch line. The other one, the internal line that connected to the few other huts along this stretch, and to a couple of maintenance offices. I picked it up and said my name, and there was a pause, and then a man's voice said, "You logged it." Good. I asked who I was speaking to, and he said Bennett, up at the Carnaby box. Just calling to check. First one you've had. I said yes, and he said, "You will get used to them. Don't walk down to it. Don't shine a torch at it. Just log it and wait." And then he hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment. The hut was very quiet. The heater clicked on and off. Outside, the wind moved through the cutting in that low, hollow way it does when there is nothing to break it up. I went through the logbook again, more carefully this time. I started counting. In the 11 years of records, EY117 had gone red unscheduled 643 times. That was an average of more than once a week. The durations varied, but the pattern Reaver had told me about held. Nothing over 4 minutes. The closest was 3 minutes and 56 seconds, recorded by a technician whose initials I did not recognize, on a date about 7 years back. There was a small note beside it in different handwriting that said, "Close one." Nothing else. I tried to look up EY117 in the technical documentation that was supposed to be in the cabinet under the desk. The folder was there, but the page for that specific signal had been removed. The page numbers jumped from 116 to 118. The contents index still listed EY117 with a page reference, but the page itself was gone. Not torn out, just removed cleanly, as if it had been taken out for photocopying and never put back. I did not mention any of this at the handover with Reaver the next morning. He asked me if I had had a quiet shift, and I said it had been mostly quiet, and I told him about the red signal at 2 in the morning. He nodded and asked the duration, and when I told him, he said, "That is about average." He did not ask anything else. I want to describe the area properly, because I think the place matters. The line runs through a kind of country that looks ordinary in daylight and stops looking ordinary at night. Flat fields, hedgerows, a few isolated farms with their lights too far away to mean anything. The cutting where the hut sits is about 12 feet deep, with steep grass banks on both sides. To the north, the line curves slightly and disappears behind a stand of trees. To the south, where EY 117 stands, the line runs straight for about half a mile before it goes under a bridge and then bends west toward Driffield. There is an access road that runs parallel to the line on the eastern side, a narrow tarmac track that maintenance vehicles use. There are no streetlights on it. At night, if you stand outside the hut, the only light comes from the signal itself, and from the small bulb above the hut door, and from whatever the moon is doing. On clear nights you can see a long way. On overcast nights you can see almost nothing, and the signal sits in the dark like a single colored star at the end of the cutting. In my second week, I started keeping my own private log alongside the official one, not because I suspected anything specific, just because I wanted to understand the pattern. I wrote down every unscheduled read, the duration, the weather conditions, the time of night, the day of the week. I did not see any obvious pattern at first. The reds happened at all hours, in all weathers. They did not cluster around particular dates. They did not correlate with train movements or maintenance activity or anything else I could think of. What I did notice, after about 3 weeks, was that the durations were creeping up, slowly, not in a way that anyone would catch if they were just doing the official job of logging and waiting. But when I plotted the numbers on a piece of graph paper one slow afternoon, the trend was there. In my first week, the average duration of an unscheduled read was about 2 minutes 20. In my third week, it was closer to 3 minutes 10, still well under the 4-minute threshold, but moving. I went back through the official logbook and did the same exercise for the older entries. The pattern held there too. Over the 11 years of records, the average duration had crept upward, very slowly, with occasional drops back down that seemed to follow no rhythm I could identify. The drops, I noticed, often happened after entries marked with a small symbol in the margin, a kind of half-circle drawn in pencil. There were maybe a dozen of these symbols across the 11 years. There was no key explaining what they meant. I asked Reaver about the symbols at the next handover. I tried to make it casual, just curiosity about the record-keeping conventions. He looked at the pages I showed him, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "That was Holland's. He used to draw those. He retired before you started." I asked what they meant, and Reaver said, "I never asked him." I did not believe that. I think Reaver knew exactly what they meant, but I also understood, by then, that there was a way of talking about EY 117 in that hut, and a way of not talking about it, and Reaver was very practiced at the not talking. He was not unfriendly. He was not evasive in a hostile way. He was just a man who had decided long ago what he was willing to say out loud, and he stuck to it. The first time I broke the procedure was in my 5th week. I want to be honest about why I did it, because I have thought about this a lot since. It was not bravery, and it was not curiosity exactly. It was that I had started sleeping badly on my off days, and I had started thinking about EY 117 when I was at home, and I had begun to feel that the not knowing was worse than whatever knowing would be. That is a feeling I would warn anyone away from, now, but at the time it felt like clarity. It was a Tuesday, just after 11 at night. The signal went red. There was no scheduled train. I started the timer. At 1:30, I picked up my torch, the one with the red filter, and I left the hut. I want to describe what I saw, but I have to do it carefully, because what I saw was not dramatic. It was small. It was the kind of thing that, if you described it to someone in a pub, they would not be impressed. The horror was in the details and in the implications, and those do not translate well. I walked along the access road toward the signal. The night was cold and still. The air smelled of wet grass and diesel, which is what that whole stretch of line always smelled of. My torch made a small red circle on the tarmac in front of me. I could see EY 117 ahead, glowing red, perfectly steady. The 4 lamps of a 4-aspect signal are stacked vertically, and only the top one, the red, was lit. The others were dark. About 50 yards from the signal, I stopped. I do not know exactly why I stopped. I had intended to walk all the way to it, to look at the housing, to see if there was something physically wrong with it, some loose wire or fault that the diagnostics were not picking up. But 50 yards away, I stopped, and I stood very still, and I listened. There was a sound. It was very faint. It was the sound of something on the rails, somewhere south of the signal, beyond the bridge. It was not the sound of a train. It was a slower sound, a kind of soft, irregular knocking, the way you would imagine a slack chain might sound if it were being dragged at walking pace over the sleepers in the ballast. It was rhythmic but not mechanical. It would knock, 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 and then pause, and then knock again, and the pauses were not the same length each time. I stood there and listened for I do not know how long, probably less than a minute. The sound did not get closer, and it did not get further away. It just continued, somewhere out beyond the bridge, in the dark, on the line. Then EY 117 cycled to green. The red light went out and the green light came on, and the sound stopped, not faded. Stopped, as if a recording had been switched off. I walked back to the hut. I logged the duration, which had been 3 minutes and 22 seconds. I did not log anything else. I sat at the desk and I drank a cup of tea, and my hands were not steady. The internal phone rang about 10 minutes later. I picked it up and the same voice as before said, "You went out." I said yes. He said, "Did you go past the signal?" I said no. He said, "Good. Don't go past it. Don't ever go past it." And he hung up. I want to say I learned my lesson and never broke procedure again, but that would not be true. What I did instead was become more careful about how I broke it. I started watching the signal more closely on the monitors when it went red. The cameras covered the area immediately around EY 117 and a short stretch of line on either side, but the bridge was at the edge of the camera's range, and anything beyond it was not visible. I could not see what was making the knocking sound. The cameras showed me an empty stretch of line and an empty signal and nothing else. In my 7th week, I met the 3rd person who would come to matter in this. Her name was Eileen Warham, and she worked for the local council in some capacity that was never entirely clear to me. Something involving land access and historic rights of way. She came to the hut one afternoon to ask about a footpath that crossed the line about a mile south. I made her tea and we talked for a while, and at some point she mentioned that her father had worked on this line, back when it was a busier route, and that he had retired in the 80s. I asked her if he had ever mentioned EY 117. I did not mean to ask it. It came out before I had thought about whether I should. She was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea. Then she said, "My father told me once that there used to be a level crossing south of here, before the bridge was built. a farm crossing. It was decommissioned in 1962. There was an accident there before it was decommissioned. He would not tell me what kind of accident. He just said that after they put the bridge in and took the crossing out, the signal down there started behaving oddly. He said the older men used to say it was the crossing trying to come back. He said that was just talk, but he said they all had a rule about it. You logged when it went red, and you waited, and you never walked past it after dark. I asked her if she knew what would happen if you did. She said, "My father said the men who had walked past it had not been the same afterwards." He did not explain what that meant. He said one of them had left the railway. He said the other one had stayed on but had been moved to a different stretch of line and had been quiet for the rest of his career. That was all he ever told me. She finished her tea and she went, and I sat in the hut for a long time afterwards, and I thought about the bridge and the decommissioned crossing and the knocking sound on the rails beyond it. The official records in the hut did not go back as far as 1962. They started in the year the current signal had been installed, which was 2013. There would have been older records somewhere in some archive, but I did not have access to them, and I did not know how to ask for them without flagging myself as someone who was taking too much interest. I had started to feel by then that taking too much interest was something to be avoided. Not because anyone had threatened me, because the whole structure of the job was built around not taking too much interest, and I had begun to understand that the structure existed for a reason. In my 9th week, Mr. Aldridge came out to the hut. It was a scheduled visit, a quarterly inspection, and he spent about an hour going through the logbook and the equipment and asking me routine questions. At the end of the visit, as he was packing up his briefcase, he said, "Settling in all right?" I said yes, and he said, "Reaver tells me you are thorough." "That is good. We like thorough." He paused, and then he said, "You have noticed, of course, that EY-117 has a personality." I said I had noticed. He said, "Every signal on this network has something. Most of them have nothing interesting. Some of them have. EY-117 has more than most. The procedure exists because the procedure works. We have tried other things over the years. The procedure works. Do you understand what I am telling you?" I said I thought I did. He said, "The 4-minute threshold is not arbitrary. We chose it carefully. If you ever see the signal pass 4 minutes, you call dispatch, and you stay in the hut, and you do not open the door until someone comes to relieve you. That is the procedure. The procedure has not been triggered in 11 years. We would prefer it not be triggered on your watch. Do you have any questions?" I had many questions. I asked none of them. I said I understood. He nodded, and he picked up his briefcase, and he left. The weeks after that were strange. I had been given, in that conversation, a kind of permission to know without knowing. Aldridge had not explained anything. He had only confirmed that there was something to explain, and that confirmation, combined with everything else I had observed, settled into me in a way I have struggled to describe ever since. I was not afraid in a sharp way. I was afraid in a slow, low way, like a hum in the floor. I kept doing the job. I kept logging the reds. I kept watching the trend on my private graph. The durations continued to creep up. In my 11th week, the average was 3 minutes 20. In my 12th week, 3 minutes 30. The longest single red in that period was 3 minutes 51. I logged it and I did not call dispatch. And I sat in the hut with my hands flat on the desk and I waited for it to clear. And when it did, I made another cup of tea and I did not drink it. I thought more than once about quitting, but I had been out of work for 14 months before I took this job, and the money was good, and my wife had started smiling again, and I told myself that as long as I followed the procedure would protect me. That is the kind of thing you tell yourself when you have understood the situation, but have decided not to act on the understanding. The night it happened was a Thursday in late November. There had been heavy rain all afternoon, and then the rain had stopped about an hour after dark, and the air had that washed, settled quality you get after a long downpour. I had eaten my dinner. I had done my checks. Everything on the monitors looked normal. EY-117 went red at 12:43 in the morning. There was no scheduled train. I started the timer. At 1 minute, it was still red. This was normal. At 2 minutes, it was still red. This was normal. At 3 minutes, it was still red. I noticed I was holding my breath, and I made myself breathe. I checked the diagnostic. No fault indicated. I checked the cameras. The stretch of line around the signal was empty. The signal itself was glowing red, perfectly steady, the way it always did. At 3 minutes 30, I picked up the dispatch phone and put my finger on the keypad and waited. At 3 minutes 50, I dialed the first digit. At 3 minutes 56, I dialed the second. At 4 minutes and 1 second, the signal was still red. I dialed the rest of the number. The phone rang twice. A woman answered. I gave her my hut code and the signal designation and the duration. She said, "Hold the line, please." I held the line. I could hear her typing. She came back on and she said, "Technician, please confirm. EY-117 has exceeded the 4-minute threshold." I confirmed. She said, "Remain in the hut. Lock the door. Do not look out of the window. We are dispatching a team. Estimated arrival 50 minutes. Do you understand the instructions?" I said I did. She said, "Stay on the line if you wish. Some technicians prefer to." I said I would stay on the line. I locked the door. I sat at the desk with the phone against my ear, and I did not look out of the window. The dispatcher did not speak. I could hear her breathing, very faintly, and the small sounds of her workstation in the background. The hut was very quiet. The heater clicked on and off. The fluorescent tube above the desk hummed, the way they always do, that low electric note. Outside, the wind had dropped. There was no other sound at first. Then I heard the knocking. It was much closer than it had been before. It was not beyond the bridge. It was on the access road, somewhere south of the hut, moving slowly. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock, pause. Knock, 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 mock. The rhythm was the same as before, irregular within its pattern. I did not look out of the window. The dispatcher said, very quietly, "Are you still with me?" I said I was. She said, "Good. Keep talking to me if you like. Tell me about your day. Tell me anything." I told her about the weather. I told her about a book I had been reading. I told her about my wife, and about the 14 months I had been out of work, and about how I had taken this job because I had needed it. The dispatcher listened and made small sounds of acknowledgement, and the knocking moved past the hut and continued northward, slowly, along the access road. I could hear it through the walls. It was not loud. It was just there. At some point, the knocking stopped. I did not hear it leave. It just stopped being audible, the way the sound on the line had stopped the night I walked out. I kept talking to the dispatcher anyway. I do not remember what I said. The maintenance team arrived at 1:38. I know because they knocked on the door, 3 sharp knocks. And then a voice said, "This is Crawley, team leader, opening the door now." The key turned from the outside. 2 men in high visibility jackets came in. One of them took the phone from me and spoke to the dispatcher and ended the call. The other one made me a cup of tea. They were both very calm and very practiced. They had clearly done this before. Crawley sat across the desk from me and asked me a series of questions. Had I looked out of the window? Had I opened the door? Had I heard anything? I answered honestly. When I told him about the knocking on the access road, he nodded and wrote it down and did not seem surprised. He asked me how long it had lasted. I said I did not know, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15. He wrote that down too. Then he said, "The signal is green now." It cycled back at 4 minutes and 41 seconds. "We are going to relieve you for the rest of the shift. You will have 3 days off, paid, and then you can decide whether you want to return to the post. There is no pressure either way. Some people come back, some people do not. Both are acceptable." I asked him what had happened. I asked it without much hope, and I was not surprised when he gave me the kind of answer I had come to expect from people in that job. He said, "EY-117 has a fault that we have not been able to fix in 11 years. The fault has parameters. We work within the parameters. Tonight the fault came close to exceeding its parameters but did not. The procedure worked. You followed the procedure correctly. That is all I can tell you." I said, "What is on the other side of the bridge?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "The line, just the line. There is nothing on the other side of the bridge that is not on this side of the bridge. Do you understand what I am telling you?" I said I did. I am not sure I did then. I think I do now. I took the 3 days off and I went home and I slept badly. My wife asked me what was wrong and I told her the job was harder than I had expected and that I was thinking about whether to continue. She said she would support whatever I decided. I sat in our kitchen for most of those 3 days, and I thought about EY-117, and about the knocking on the access road, and about Eileen Warham's father, and the men who had walked past the signal and had not been the same. I went back. I want to be clear about that. I went back because the money was good and because I had told myself during those 3 days that the procedure had worked, and that if I continued to follow the procedure would continue to work.